And then you read your book and you say, wow, wait a minute, I remember this. Well, yeah, you wrote the book. So you're only going back on what you already... The human mind can do that. And what we have to do is realize we did not lose our culture. We forgot it. And that's very important, because when you lose something, it means you got to go out and actively find it. But when you forgot it, all you got to do is remember. And I've always looked at teaching as being a facilitator. I cannot, each and every one of us that came in here, whatever I say, you came in here already knowing it. All I did was facilitate you recognizing that you already know. How could I ever put something in your head that wasn't already there? Your mind is the Akashic Records. It is the collection of all of its cosmic encyclopedia. And so as we move through this process, and as I began to teach our children, I began to develop, and it is the Freedom Home Academy that adapted one of the curriculums that I wrote. It's called The Historic Journey. And so I encourage you, when you get a chance, to go to thehistoricjourney.org. And you'll see the type of curriculum that I'm talking about. It was developed for the Indianapolis public school system. They can't handle that. And when I say they, I mean those of Western culture. And sometimes it includes us. And like, let's cry that river, build a bridge, but get over it. Because that's just a reality. For those that have been indoctrinated into this Western system, I'm not wasting no more time. We don't have any more time to convert anybody.
Repeat that, brother.
No more conversion.
No more conversion.
No more conversion. If I have to convince you of what I'm saying, there's nothing I can say that will convince you.
That's right.
If I don't have to convince you, then let's just roll back our sleeves and get the job done.
Exactly.
So either way, I don't have time to try to convince you of how this works. I am an example of what happens when you're introduced to your culture. I was born Booker T. Coleman. When I first met Professor Clark, I was 12 and a half. He said, oh, Booker T, you're going to be a great teacher. I said, oh, yeah, sure, okay. Because that wasn't necessarily on my mind. But I've been deeply steeped in culture all my life. And because of that, everything that I've looked at in my life, I've always looked at from an African-American perspective. And so when that happens, you begin to build your neurons. Because that's what we have to do. We have to connect our neurons of the brain. That's what a teacher's doing. That's what culture does. It connects your neurons. When we were in Africa, hundreds of years ago, we were in a community where we knew each other. We knew the foods that we ate, the games that we played, the friends that we played with, the elders that we respected. That's called, in the brain, it's called association. You're associated. And in that, your neurons connect to that association. But then when Urugu came and ripped us away from our community, they brought us to a place we did not have our history, we didn't know the language, we didn't understand values, interests, and principles of the people we were with or the conditions we were under. And so, in that being reality, our neurons that were associated were disassociated and then reassociated to adjust to Western civilization. Dr. Sheikh Anta Diop tells us that if somebody wishes to oppress you, and this has nothing to do with culture, this just has to do with somebody trying to oppress another person. They'll take your history, they'll take your language, they'll take your psychological factor. Your psychological factor is what Dr. Leonard Jeffries calls your values, your interests, and your principles, your VIPs. And then they will superimpose their history, their language, their values, interests, and principles on you. And so therefore, whatever conclusion you come to, whatever decision you make is never going to be in your best interest because you're looking at the world through someone else's eyes.
Yes.
And this is what we've been doing for the past 402 years, at least here, for this current time. For this current time. Because Africans been here for 120,000 years.
Yes. At least.
And David and Hotep has got the evidence to that in his book, The First Americans Were Africans. Okay? Now, for me, that's no more discussion.
Exactly.
I'm done discussing this. I'm done discussing whether Egypt was black. Now, I know there's a lot of other people that will talk to you about that. Go to them. Don't come to me. Because science has already shown me who the original Kush... In fact, it's not just Kemet that we're dealing with. The first dynasty of Kemet was not Egyptian. You see, what happened is that when you're looking at the world through the eastern corridor of where the Amu or the Indo-European first came in, they then came, they saw it, and they took the name, which was Hiku Ptah, which means the spirit or the essence of Ptah, the mound builder, and they converted it in the Greek language to Egu Ptos. Hiku Ptah became Egu Ptos. And then, as years of further contamination of our language, Egu Ptos became Ej. So even when we're using the word Egypt, that is not a European name. That's an African, that's a derivative of an African word, Hiku Ptah. It's all ours, family. The only thing that Europeans invented was the Xerox machine and a patent office.
Exactly. So they can steal more stuff.
That's it. They stole everybody's idea and made copies of it.
Biggest copies in the world.
So that's why I tell black folks, don't worry, they're not going to kill all of us.
No, they can't.
Because where would their next idea come from?
It's the truth.
They are not original at all. And not only that, but they contaminate everything that they touch. So what is of a Ma'atian ethic becomes something very different. And so our history and our culture, looking at Kemet, the first dynasty is not a first dynasty. It is a continuation of the Kushite dynasties that traveled north.
Right.
Yes.
You can see it in Kustal, and then from Kustal they go to Edfu, and then they go Abydos, and then they keep moving up until they redivert the waters of the Hapi or the Nile River, build up land, and then they create what's called Hiku Ptah, or the land of Ptah, and they built the capital, the theocratic capital that's today called Memphis. But that's coming from the word of the individual Menefer.
Yes.
But the Kemetic the first dynasty is not a first dynasty. It's the first dynasty for Western civilization, because that's when they came upon Africans. But really, you have to look at the northern migration of Africans that are going to leave, coming up through Sudan, Ethiopia, Somalia, Djibouti, and they're going to find themselves in this area that we today call Kemet. And it's the same thing with the 25th dynasty. That's not the 25th dynasty. That's the 6th Napatan dynasty. But because they want to give it to Egypt, and they want to say, well, this is the one that's African because it's so obvious African. But guess what? All of the major kingdoms were African. And the evidence of it is in stone. And yet somehow, we're still arguing about this. We're still trying to impress people that this land was an African land. No more conversation. Because we have to teach our children the truth. And the moment you argue your case, you give those who you're arguing with legitimacy that they have a side. Dr. Clark used to say, to have a debate, you have to have a side. Europeans don't have a side. So how can you debate somebody that don't have a side? But if you argue with them, you give them a side. So there's no more argument. I can direct you to people that will argue with you. But homie, don't play that no more. Because of our children. Look out on the streets at our children. We have to bring this knowledge and wisdom to them. And we don't have time to deal with them anymore. And so, I tell people, I don't write books because I'm a writer. I write books because I have something to say. And back in the early 80s when I was going for my first master's degree, I spoke to Dr. Clark. He was at Hunter College. He was the chairperson for the Black and Puerto Rican Studies Department. And I went to him and I said, you know, I'm finishing up my coursework because I was at Hunter College doing my work. I was trying to get him to be my supervisor, but they would not let me work with him. I had to work through the history department. He was in Black Studies. Black Studies did not offer that type of master's degree. So if I wanted a master's, I had to go into a department that had a master's and a postgraduate department. So he said, well, you know, you do a lot of curriculum writing and staff development. And he said, so if you really want to go there, I want you to go to the root of what you're doing. And he said, I had a teacher, and his name was Professor William Leo Hansberry from Howard University. And he said, for what you're doing, always go back to the root in order to understand where you are, to project where you want to go. And so he said, you need to study him, do your master's on William Leo Hansberry, understand who he is. And I did some preliminary research at Schaumburg in Harlem, New York. And so I said, okay, I'm going to do it. So what I did is in April of 1984, I started the process. I went to Washington, D.C., and I interviewed Dr. Chancellor Williams, and I worked with Dr. Williams for a while in D.C. I also interviewed Dr. Charles Wesley. He was 93 at this time. This was the brother who was the chairperson for the social science department that hired William Leo Hansberry. He was the man that hired William Leo Hansberry. And then I interviewed a number of other people. And then I started my coursework. Any Black Studies department that exists anywhere in the United States and even part of the world, anybody who's interested in Black Studies, if you don't know who William Leo Hansberry is, then you don't know Black Studies. Because William Leo Hansberry, directly or indirectly, impacted. William Leo Hansberry had a student by the name of Dr. Nnamdi Azikiwe from Nigeria, who was the first prime minister and president. And when William Leo Hansberry joined the Ancestors, when he transitioned, Nnamdi Azikiwe wrote a eulogy, and it said it was William Leo Hansberry who grounded him in African studies and African history that encouraged him to want to go back home in order to build what was necessary. Kwame Nkrumah was in Lincoln University in Pennsylvania.
And was influenced by Azikiwe.
Exactly. And he used to travel from Pennsylvania to Washington to study with William Leo Hansberry. So that directly or indirectly, William Leo Hansberry has had a transformative. When I interviewed Dr. Chancellor Williams, one of the things that Dr. Williams told me that stood out in my mind was when I asked him what type of teacher he was. Chancellor Williams says, he was the type of teacher that was vitally interested in you. Not just that he was your professor in class. He wanted to know, how do you enjoy your weekends? What do you do? You know, how do you, what do you do for pastime? He wanted to know about you because he understood that if he knew about you, he could teach you. And Dr. Williams said that when you were in his class, you could not take your attention away from him. That you were engrossed in what he was saying. And the reason why he was engrossed was because he loved what he was doing. And there's nothing more beautiful than to work in something that you love doing. Mm-hmm. Like what I'm doing now. You know, last night when I spoke, they said, oh man, I know you must be, you've been moving around. But I told them, I said, I'm energized. Mm-hmm. This energizes me. Right. This doesn't make me tired. Right. Now when I go home and I'm sitting, then I get tired. But when I'm engaged in this, I understand what William Leo Hansberry, how he was, because he felt it. It was vitally important to him to be able to get to you. And he often said, if the student hasn't learned, the teacher hasn't taught. And family, I've taught middle school. Okay, I've taught children that don't know if they want to crawl, walk, swim, fly, and sometimes they want to do it all at the same time. When you get to that 7th, 8th grade point, some of the greatest lessons I've learned on how to teach came from the hardest heads. Because I took it upon as a responsibility, I got to get to that brother or sister somehow. So how am I going to become a better teacher? Some of the roughest necks made me the teacher I became. Because it wasn't about them failing. Because if they failed, that was a failure on my part, not on theirs. And I think a lot of teachers blame the children for what they cannot do as educators. Oh, you failed the test. No. The teacher failed the test because you didn't teach the child what they needed to know. There are a number of ways you can do this now. There are a lot of ways that you can do this, that you can put them in someone else's care. You can have someone that you know that they will listen to. There's a number of ways you can educate children. So, William Leo Hansberry. But in the back of my mind, Shabaka Stone was the book I wanted to write.
Yes.
My mother came home 1977, and I had written like a novel. Haven't published it, but I wrote a novel on Ethiopia. It was a story about Ethiopia, and it was a combination with the African American experience. And my mother went to the Xerox room to make copies of what I had done. My mother worked for a major oil company. She was secretary. And the Xerox room that made Xerox copies, all brothers and sisters. And so my mother came home and said, you know, when they saw your book, they told me if your son is writing like this, he'd be very interested in this book. It was a Xerox copy of Stolen Legacy. George G.M. James. It was before it was reprinted. When it was on the underground on Xerox copy. It was on the underground.
Yeah.
Okay, that's why this place is called Underground. And so I read it, but then I got to chapter 8, page 139 to 151. It was on the Memphite theology. And that blew my mind.
Yeah. Imagine it.
To date, I had never even imagined that there was a cosmology that could be identified with human existence. And when I read that, I began developing this book. I started writing Shabaka Stone. But there was a lot more I had to do. And basically what Shabaka Stone is, it's a rewritten version of a much older document that the Cushites wrote. Shabaka, give or take, because I'm afraid of dates, but basically about 710 BC, before the Common Era. And what he was doing was he was paying homage to his ancestors who had written this cosmology called the Memphite theology. Now here's the key about this. If you go back to when the cosmology was first written in the Memphite theology, you give it a date. And then you go to 710 when Shabaka rewrote it. Okay, that's one set of years. Now, if you go to when Shabaka rewrote it, and June 13, 2021, more time elapsed between when Shabaka rewrote his ancestors' text than when I wrote Shabaka Stone. So what is happening is that Shabaka was honoring elders that went further back in time than even we're honoring Shabaka right now. Okay? That's how ancient this document is, and this is how long our ancestors have been theoretical scientists. And if Shabaka is saying that it's as good today as it was back then, but we're going to add a little bit more because over the thousands of years, we've learned some things. So we're going to update it. That's what I did with Shabaka Stone. What I did was I honored William Leo Hansberry as my ancestor. See, that's why all three books are related. They are interdependent, but they're also independent. Because you could pick up any one of these and read it, and that could be a capsule information. But when you read them in totality, when you see how they all relate to each other, you begin to understand exactly how dynamic William Leo Hansberry was. So I'm paying homage to William Leo Hansberry. And that's why it's called an intellectual libation for the architect of America's African Studies program. This is a libation, because you know, as an African, you don't start anything without calling upon your ancestors.
Yes.
Because when you act without your ancestors' recognition and your elders' permission, you're acting alone. And there's nothing in the world worse than acting alone. So I began this process by writing and honoring Professor William Leo Hansberry. This is a man that we all should know. Even if you're not into black studies, what this man did to make it possible for what we're doing today in black studies, what he gave up and what he did, he and his students developed maps that didn't exist because nobody was interested in Africa. There were no maps that, like, because I've been in his house. One of the things I did in D.C. is I went into his house, I spoke to his daughters, Gail and Kay Hansberry. They allowed me to go down into his library. And he had maps. First time ever driven, lithographs, graphs that never existed before. And it came out of his scientific research that he laid out certain things about Ethiopia that we did not know. For those that know Dr. Ben, Dr. Ben is to Kemet what William Leo Hansberry is to Ethiopia.
Exactly.
He was the expert on Ethiopia, along with another brother, a good friend of his, by the name of Dr. Charles Seifert, a Nova Scotian brother that came to the United States and studied Ethiopia. Shabaka Stone was the book I wanted to write because this, I believe, from my own perspective, for what it's done for me and what it's done for people that I've exposed this information to. Because I've also got DVDs. For every one of the books, I've got DVDs that go with these because there's visuals. Because in my piece, in my William Leo Hansberry, I'm with Dr. Leonard Jeffries, New York City College. And I do a slide presentation. The value of that DVD is the slide presentation. Because I'm going to get you real up close to William Leo Hansberry, to his wife Myrtle, to his children Gail and Kay. I'm going to show you them in Egypt. Because my books, I did not want to put it in the book because the pictures don't come out as clear as I want them to.
No, we don't.
And if it's not going to come out right, then I'd rather not do it. But my DVD has that. But William Leo Hansberry was a brother that he had a 2-volume set on African theosophy. And I spent days just reading his views on spirituality. And then I'm looking at Shabaka Stone, not as a book, but as my work. And what I'm realizing is, I need an introduction that's going to help folk move through Shabaka Stone better. And so that came my second book, Spirituality Before Religions. This is where I analyze the major texts of Kemet. I analyze the Memphite theology, the pyramid text, the coffin text, the book of the coming forth, the day by night. I look at the judgment scene and I do a whole piece on the judgment scene. I then go to the Aten text and then I go back to Shabaka Stone. You know, there is, in the pyramid text, there's utterances. The most intact example of the pyramid text we find on the wall of the temple, tomb, and pyramid of Unas, the Pharaoh, also known as Neset Biti. We didn't call them Pharaoh, we call them Neset Biti, the one who has the right to rule. And also, by the way, sisters, we called our sisters Hemet Neset Waret. Hemet, H-E-M-E-T, N-E-S-E-T, W-A-R-E-T. Now, when you take the metaphor and explain what that means, it basically means this is how we felt towards our women. Long before they were the bees and all the other names we had for them, they were Hemet Neset Waret, which means women were the deep well of water that we return to when we are parched by the desert.
Can you
Now,
repeat that?
okay. Hemet Neset Waret. the deep well of water. This is Mfudishi.
Yes.
Drop this on you. Okay?
I know.
He said, it is the deep well of water we return to, we as men,
Yes.
our sisters, our queens, those that sit beside us. The deep well of water we go to, we return to when we are parched by the desert. Now, for people who have never been in the desert, you don't know what parched means.
Yes.
Now, you may have been thirsty, but you ain't never been parched. When dust be popping out your mouth when you're talking. And you know,
I'm at the store.
for those that have been in,
He's lecturing.
that have been in the
He's
desert,
lecturing right now.
that you know that
I'm
the one thing on your mind when you are parched, there's only one thing that will satisfy you, and that's water. I mean, you want water so bad, you create mirages that you think you see water.
And run towards it.
Imagine, yes. Imagine if we felt that way towards our woman, our queen. That in their absence, we could imagine their presence and run towards them and jump, put our mouth in sand. Think of the metaphor of how we felt towards our women and the role they played in our life. But water is one thing. But they're not just. It's all over.
Return of the African goddess.
It's done. It's done. And so as I think of the Neset Biti Unas, the last pharaoh of the 5th dynasty, but it's an utterance, it's the voice of God, the voice of the Creator that you're listening to, that transforms your thinking. I cite a particular set of utterances, 287 and 288, I believe, or 288, 289, in the pyramid text, where it talks about Unas, who transforms himself into Apis, the bull. And as a bull, he starts to eat the body and drink the blood of the gods, which as a Roman Catholic is the Eucharistic feast.
Yes. Yes.
Okay? That's where it came
Yes.
from.